This is a Parsha podcast brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study, and I'm your host, Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. Let's learn. Welcome back to the Matan podcast, where this year we are exploring the weekly Haftorah portion. This week's episode has been sponsored for the 10th yahrzeit of Nathan Werdiger, Natan ben Dvorah Shlomo Elimelech, by his daughters Michelle Feiglin and Debbie Nussbaum. Nathan was liberated from Buchenwald and rebuilt his life in Melbourne, Australia. He inspired their love of Torah learning, and at every lunchtime in the middle of his working day, he could be found in front of his Gemara. He had great success in business, but he always said that his biggest success was his family. For those of you who listen weekly, sponsoring an episode can be a great way to honor a memory, a friend, and even mark a momentous occasion. For more information, contact me at podcast@matan.org.il or the Matan office. Parshat Vayechi chronicles Yaakov's preparation for death. These preparations open with his request from Yosef that he be buried in Canaan, continues with the blessings of his two sons, of Yosef's two sons, a scene which has a potential to end disastrously like Yaakov and Esav's, but thankfully does not. Yaakov then calls all of his sons to deliver what is often called the testament of Yaakov, mostly blessings, which he bestows upon his children with many hints to their future tribal realities. Yaakov dies, and mourning practices are observed both according to Egyptian and Israelite tradition. After this, the brothers have their final interaction with Yosef, wherein they fear that Yosef will finally take revenge on them once their father has passed. But he, in tremendous gvura, reminds them that his theological perspective on his life story has calmed any fratricidal desires. Not only will he not kill them, but he promises to take care of them and their families for the foreseeable future. While tremendous effort was made to bring Yaakov back to Canaan, Yosef remains in Egypt in a coffin, but leaves instructions to remove him at the right time. This week's Haftorah is taken from Melachim Aleph, Perek Bet, or 1 Melachim, chapter 2, the first 12 verses of the chapter, which follows the Haftorah we learned with Dr. Nechama Price about the physical weakening of David and the efforts of Natan and Bathsheba to have Shlomo appointed as his successor. In this chapter, David gives Shlomo several assignments and some pointed assassinations to commit in order to safely establish his rule. The chapter is structured in 3 parts. The first 9 psukim are parting instructions to Shlomo. Then we have 2 psukim that describe David's death, and then the rest of the relatively long chapter from pasuk 12 to 46 are Shlomo's actions. In order to unpack this Haftorah, I'm excited to welcome a new guest, Rabbi Zvi Grumet.
Hi.
So nice to have you here. Rabbi Grumet, prior to making Aliyah, spent 2 decades teaching teens in the U.S. In Israel, he has taught for many years at Machon Pardes and chaired the Tanakh department at Yeshivat Eretz Tzvi. He is currently director of education at the Lookstein Center of Bar Ilan University. He teaches throughout the English-speaking world, leads professional development for teachers, and has published numerous articles both in education and Tanakh. His books include Moshe and the Path to Leadership, Genesis from Creation to Covenant, the Chumash Koren Liv Ladat, and Exodus, the Genesis of God's people. I'm so happy you're joining us today.
It's great to be here.
Your name within the Tanakh world has been one that's always been in the back of my mind, and I don't know why it took this long, but I'm happy that you're here with us today to unpack this. And what I really like also about this perek is that our listeners are coming in with a lot of information. It's not like in one week where we jump into Zechariah or we're jumping into these books or we're jumping into Amos. But in this case, already a few weeks ago, Chazal had chosen the first chapter of Melachim when it was connected there to the death of Abraham. So here, the Haftorah begins of a Kirvu Yemei David Lemut, and that David's time to die is approaching. And that, of course, connects us to our parsha where the days of Yaakov are ending. So maybe we'll start there for our conversation about the connection between those 2 pieces.
Okay. Well, just to begin, it's not only that they're about to die, but they leave legacies behind.
Yeah.
I mean, Yaakov leaves a legacy for his kids, and David does the same. They're very different, though.
Yes.
The legacy that Yaakov leaves for his kids really is pointed to them and their native qualities. And each kid gets their own bracha, which is unique in Sefer Bereshit.
Yeah.
And those brachot relate to who they are and what their strengths and their weaknesses are and how they can capitalize on those or compensate for their weaknesses in the future.
It's also such a big leap forward from our divisive rivalry for that one blessing in the case of Yitzchak. And here we see that we've changed generations. We no longer have to have one blessing, but there's enough for everybody to go around, which is an interesting question in of itself. What changed? But maybe we'll just leave it at the fact that it changed.
David, when he calls Shlomo and gives him instructions before he dies, he mentions only one thing about Shlomo, which we already know, or which we'll find out soon, which is his wisdom. V'asita kachochmatecha, he says multiple times. He understands that Shlomo is an intelligent young man and is going to do things wisely. But aside from that, he really doesn't say something about Shlomo. He gives him instructions. Here's what you need to do. And we're not talking long term. He's like, there are 3 very specific instructions that he gives him about what to do, and one general one about just make sure that you stick to the mitzvot if you want to be successful.
Right. I'll just say about the chokhmah and the mitzvot is that right after the execution, pun intended, the execution of these instructions to a certain degree, so the next prakim we have about Shlomo are about those 2 pieces, or about where he initially is starting off, and his wisdom, we clearly had a natural inclination, is augmented by God's blessing. He asked God to make his wisdom even greater, and God grants that request, and even really compliments him for that being his request in life, not for Osher, but for chokhmah. And the other piece is also this idea of following the mitzvot. And we know that ultimately, right, Shlomo will fall in that realm. But we certainly start off feeling very optimistic about where Shlomo is starting his career from.
Yes.
But what are those things that David speaks to him about that he requested he do? And I'm curious also how you understand it. Are they requests? Are they suggestions? What is he telling him to do?
Well, there are 3 things he tells him to do. 2 of them are basically assassinations. They sound like political assassinations or personal vendettas. And one of them is paying back a personal favor. The assassinations or the killings are for Yoav ben Tzeruya, who was David's general, loyal general throughout his entire life. And David asks Shlomo to take care of him. He doesn't say exactly. He says, "Do as you see fit, as your wisdom tells you. Just make sure he gets retribution for the things that he did during his life." And the other one is for Shimei ben Gera. Shimei ben Gera, he was from Shevet Binyamin, fiercely loyal to Shaul, and during the rebellion, when David was running from his son, from Avshalom, Shimei ben Gera came down and basically threw rocks at him and cursed him and said, "You're getting what you deserve for rebelling against the real king." Shaul was the real king. Later on, he apologized. And David at the time said, "Don't worry about it. Nothing's going to happen." David's generals wanted to kill him, but David didn't let them. And now on his deathbed, David basically tells Shlomo, "I didn't kill him, but you should act wisely and do what you think is just act wisely." And then, so those are what seem like personal vendettas. And then we have the one where there was somebody who lived in the region that David ran to, Gilad. And Gilad was also, they had a historical loyalty to Shaul. David got there, and there were a number of people who actually came to take care of David, make sure he had food, make sure he was taken care of. One of them was an old man named Barzillai HaGiladi from Gilad. And David at the time wanted to show gratitude to Barzillai, said, "I want you to come live with me in the palace. Stay close to me." And Barzillai says, "I'm an old man." So David basically said, "Okay, so your kids can come live with me." And one of David's last messages to Shlomo was, make sure that you continue to show gratitude to Barzillai's children.
Yeah, I think what also comes through in these pieces, Yoav is more complicated, but in the Shimei ben Gera and in the case of Barzillai, is we're hovering around the aftermath of Shalom's rebellion, right? Meaning we're about to get into, we're in Adoniyahu's rebellion, or we're right after that piece, but we still have really like the ricochet from that moment of David's life, which was probably, other than the Bathsheba story, is sort of the most, I think, significant and foretelling about what his kids their future will be as well.
Yeah, well, those events really dominate David's life.
Yeah.
Starting with the incident with Bathsheba, it takes up the bulk of Shmuel Beit.
Yeah.
So the bulk of the stories we have of David's life are about the aftermath of the incident with Bathsheba, including Avshalom's rebellion, which is directly connected to that.
Yeah, totally. And I think I just want to mention here, I think it's the Abarbanel who, you said when he tells Shlomo, do as you see fit. So it's a question we have, meaning is he telling him to kill them, or is he saying to Shlomo, be aware, meaning especially I think the question is significant in the case of Shimi ben Gera, because David promised not to kill him. So how is it that now he's saying, well, I didn't kill you then, but I'm going to have you killed now? And the Abarbanel's approach to this story is basically to say, David is letting Shlomo know who could be potentially a very big threat. And so he's not saying you have to kill them. Again, you might say he's saying wink, wink, right? Do it as you see fit. But the other approach says he's letting him know that this could be problematic. And if you think that the right thing to do now is to eliminate them, then you can go and eliminate them. But he's sort of just making him aware of who might be a threat to the stability of his kingdom. And I just would say that even just on the stories you described right now, that, we look at David, Melech Chai v'Kayam, but his monarchy was just filled with threats all around, meaning the first half is dominated by the remaining loyalties to Shaul, including this one of Shimi ben Gera, which meets him already later on in his career. But you have so many figures throughout his career that are not necessarily fully with David, that he's not always totally sure. He has few of his loyal people, but then a lot of that shifts because of the story of Avshalom. So I would say David is intimately familiar with the idea of that there are people here who may not be fully loyal to you, and he doesn't want Shlomo to start off his career. He wants him to start off his career on a stronger foot than he clearly started off when he started in the throes of his competition with Shaul.
Yeah. And the question is to what exactly he wanted Shlomo to do. I mean, he doesn't say kill him outright, which is what opens the door to the Abarbanel. My sense, just reading the text and reading what happens, is that Shlomo clearly understood that his father wanted him to, we want to say, to take revenge, to take a vendetta on these people. And I think when we think about it, it's more than just who can potentially cause a problem. When you look back at Shmuel Beit, and even at Shmuel Aleph, and you look at what David dedicated his life to. I mean, it's hard to see that sometimes because he always seems like he's reacting to things, right? But I think when you look and just beneath the surface, David has dedicated his entire life and career to unifying the people. Right? That comes through once you see that. Every page you open up in the Sefer really reveals that. He refuses to fight against Shaul. He refuses to fight against Avshalom, meaning civil war is the last thing he wants to tolerate. The reason he doesn't kill Shimi ben Gera is because he's afraid that is going to spark right or reignite the civil war. The reason he doesn't kill Yoav, he can't. Right, and Yoav is much more complicated. And we can talk about Yoav too. But David is committed to this notion of uniting the people under one king, one capital. That's why basically it's an incredible thing when we think about it. He didn't just move his capital from Hebron to Yerushalayim. He dissolved the kingdom of Yehuda in order to create a new kingdom. That was huge. It was a huge sacrifice. He risked his base. He offended his entire base in order to do that. Which is, I think, one of the reasons that Yoav gave him a lot of trouble. I think Yoav was part of that base who didn't like that. Yoav was was a relative, and he was from Hebron, and he really was loyal to the kingdom of Yehuda until his dying day. He wanted to restore that, and what he did, basically, the reason David tells Shlomo that I want you to take care of him, quote unquote, take care of him, is because Yoav repeatedly tries to foil David's plan to unite the kingdom. Every effort that David makes, he wants to bring somebody in, the former general, right? So when you have the former general for Shaul's son or for Shaul himself, and David wants to bring him in, and Yoav kills him, right? Same thing with Avshalom. Avshalom's general. David tries to unite the people. Yoav kills him repeatedly. Yoav he's loyal to David, but he's more loyal to the kingdom of Yehudah. And David understands that is a great threat, which is Adoniah also, the rebellion of Adoniah. Adoniah was born in Hebron. Shlomo was born in Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim is the symbol of the United Kingdom. Hebron is the symbol of the split kingdom. It's Hebron against the north.
Yeah.
And David basically says we have to make sure that doesn't happen again. The great irony is that he succeeds, but ultimately he fails, because Shlomo got the letter of the law on that one. He got rid of Shimi ben Gera, and he got rid of Yoav, but ultimately Shlomo does other things that undermine the unity of the kingdom. That's towards the end of his life.
And how are those things undermining the unity of the kingdom? Meaning having foreign women as part of your harem, or maybe even possibly your favorite wife, if we understand that way, bat paro, or how, because Shlomo's life trajectory and the things that bring sort of a downfall there, the woman part connects him deeply to his father, but it seems to be somewhat different, right? He's at a different stage of the monarchy. There's something much grander. There's a tremendous success. There's, broadening of all the boundaries of Israel. So there's something very different about Shlomo's reign, but also something that undermines it. So I'm just curious how you sort of classify that.
So I think it's pretty simple. There's one thing that's explicit in the text, and there's one thing that's up to interpretation. The thing that's explicit in the text is one of the things that everybody skips. It's one of the bureaucratic details. We hear the details of how Shlomo organized the bureaucracy in the kingdom, and he divides the kingdom up into 12 units. Each unit has to pay taxes and has to support the king, except for Shevet Yehudah. They're exempt from taxes. And right there, he did what David would never have done, but he sowed the seeds for animosity.
Yeah, which you learn about later when they complained to his son.
Yes.
When they complained to Rehoboam, his son, about the taxes that they had to pay. So you're saying they were particularly angry, not just because they had taxes, but because it wasn't equal taxation.
Yeah. And Shlomo got away with a lot because, number one, because of David. Mm-hmm. And because he was just so good at what he did. He was so successful. Built a palace that was the envy of the entire world. He built a kingdom that was the envy of the entire world. He built a Beit HaMikdash that everybody came to take a look at. He himself was such an impressive character. Yeah. Right? There was so much writing on that personality and that brilliance. Yeah. Right? And that we hear all about that. And so nobody would open their mouth to him. But when he's gone, when that personality is gone, then it opens the floodgates, and all the animosity that had been cooking under the surface. Yeah,
that wasn't spoken in that way because of the grandeur of who he was and what he had built. So then it comes out. It's interesting because if I go back to Yoav for a minute and his him and his relationship with David, Yoav is such an interesting, probably one of the most interesting characters in all of the book of Shmuel, which again is not our Haftorah, but it's sort of in the background of our Haftorah, because he's the one who also, he's that person in David's life who knows how to tell him what no one else can say to David, right? Whether it's, when he's mourning for Avshalom and he says, you're confusing the people, right? He just rebelled against you. You can't mourn for him publicly, right? And Yoav has multiple moments through the book of Shmuel where he gives tochacha to David in a way that it seems only Yoav would have been able to do. And there's something in David that, while the spirit of David is something that we still speak about today, when you read the stories, there's a tremendous humility also about David. As you said, he sacrifices a sense of grandeur in order to create a unity that he's trying to achieve. And so when you are humble in that way, the people who work for you feel much more comfortable to criticize you. Ultimately, there's a healthy checks and balances about that, but you don't see that same kind of thing when it comes to Shlomo, and then you see the ricochets of it in the next generation.
Yeah, I mean, that's... I've spent a lot of time really thinking about David. I think David's one of the greatest characters we have. When you read the description of Shlomo, you ask yourself, so how could Shlomo have sunk the way he did it, towards the end of his life, especially given all that wisdom? And there are a lot of different ways of slicing that. But one of the ideas that's been really ringing in my head for the last few months is that David always was willing to hear critique, not just from a Navi and not just from a general. He met people. He met women who had no status, and he listened to what they said, and he accepted it. He just, and that was part of his greatness.
Yeah.
Part of his greatness is that he was prepared to accept rebuke from anybody. And I think when we say David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayam, that's the model, the model of leadership that the Torah really wants to put forth, that Tanakh, I think, wants to put forth as an ideal model of leadership, is where the leader knows how to acknowledge their own mistakes and knows how to say, Chatati, I sinned, I made a mistake, right? Regardless of who it is who's delivering that message. And I think it's really ironic that there's nobody who can say that to Shlomo. That there's no court Navi, there's nobody else. Now, are they afraid of him? I don't know. It's only towards the end of his life that there's a message that Hashem says, the kingdom is going to be torn away, but not during your own lifetime.
Yeah. I guess I'm also still thinking about the connection back to the parsha. I'm thinking also of what's occupying David's thoughts, so to speak, as he winds down his life, is how to ensure that his son will be able to continue on with this thing that he's created. In the case of Yaakov, I think that it's something very different, meaning there isn't yet like this oneness of vision that we see in the end of the Torah. We have something much more diverse. We're not exactly sure where it's going, right? We're also heading into something that we know is much more difficult, right? Where in the case of David and Shlomo, there's at least temporarily, there's an uphill successful climb. Whereas in the case of our parsha, we're sort of, there's a bright future ahead of us, but we have to pass over, right, the depths of Mitzrayim in order to get there. And I don't know what I think about that. I just want to place that here. Maybe if you have any thoughts about it, but there's a very different tenor, I think, to the way that these lives are ending. With David, we have a sense of things improving until they won't. And in the case of Yaakov, we have a sense of kind of like an impending doom, right? That's about to come on to the people. And I think that, again, we always hope that future generations will grow greater and will, in the case of the family of Yaakov, they physically grow greater, meaning they multiply. But in terms of being able to fulfill their mission, there's going to be quite a delay until that piece can actually come to fruition.
There are times when the Haftorah mirrors the parsha in very, very, with a very narrow thread. Mm-hmm. There are times that they're really very much intertwined, and you really see that the Haftorah mirrors the parsha. And then there are times that I think that the Haftorah actually completes the parsha. And I think this is one of those cases where the parsha, you're right, the parsha leaves us with, the end of the Sefer actually leaves us with a lot of questions. We don't know what the future holds in store. And, there's a lot to say about that. Yaakov dies without knowing that his family's secure. We think that there's this great reunion and the story ends happily, like the Broadway play, right? But it doesn't end. It's not that they lived happily ever after. Yaakov dies, and he thinks that his children might very well be swallowed up into the Egyptian culture.
Yeah.
And who knows what's going to be. And when somebody says, "Don't worry, you're going to die in peace, and your children are going to suffer for a few hundred years," that's not very comforting. Even if they say in the end it'll turn out, really? A few hundred years?
Yeah.
And Yaakov dies with this incredible uncertainty.
And that the blessing of land is not one that's going to come to fruition anytime soon.
That's
right?
correct.
Meaning there's two prongs to the book of Bereshit. One of them is going to be, they're going to reproduce and become a great nation, but the blessing of land is not one that's going to be borne out by any of the future generations for quite a while.
Right. And I think when Chazal chose this as the Haftorah, they sort of wanted to take that story and say, well, guess what? That story has a happy ending. It takes a very, very long time.
You're saying you look at Shlomo as that happy ending?
So I think when you cut the parsha right there, David handing over the reins to Shlomo and giving him instructions, right? What they're saying is there could be a happy ending. Now, it turns out that, it's a good thing they cut the Haftorah where they do.
Yeah, no, they give a very small piece of our story.
It's a small piece of the story. We don't hear about the bloody stuff that happens afterwards. And truth is, Shlomo there are many, many good years.
Yeah.
Right? But they cut it at a point where it sounds like this is the happy ending. Right. David's gone, and the closing of the Haftorah is a reflection. It closes with David reigned for 40 years. 7 years in Hebron, 33 years in Yerushalayim. Shlomo is firmly established. Vatikon malchuto ma'od. And that's the closing. Yeah. So that is, I think, the way Chazal want us to take a look at the parsha and say, yes, there is a happy ending.
And I think also, I don't remember exactly who said it, but this idea that, where we cut the story obviously creates a certain frame, right? If we had continued to reread the rest of the parak, as we said, it gets messy, it gets more complicated, and we don't have a sense of closure. But the truth is that Tanakh doesn't end with closure, right? Famously, the last words of Sefer Devarim Vayim are Vayal, meaning the idea that hopefully we're always on some sort of upward journey, but we don't have, Tanakh doesn't ever try and present stories in a way that makes them sort of fit perfectly. But it's interesting, I think it's a beautiful point that in the Haftorah we do have that sense, like it does give us a sense of closure. We've finished the book of Bereshit, and now we're finishing here, we're closing up David's life. There also is a very similar phrasing used for the death of Yaakov, and then also saying that how many years that he lived, and we have that sense that, well, of course we know that the story becomes complex as it continues, that at least for this moment we could say a little bit almost like Dayenu, a little bit for this moment we could say Yaakov, all of his sons, they're alive and they all have their blessings, and David, and he closes his reign, and his son, he's chosen Shlomo, and Shlomo establishes his reign. Like, at least for a moment, it kind of reminds me of our political situation right now. If we take a breath now, even though we kind of know that the future is not going to be necessarily smooth, but we have to take those small moments in order to just breathe and say, okay, this is a nice moment.
So there's one other thing here in this parallel between the Haftorah and the parsha, which is interesting, and it's actually part of a very, very big picture. If you take a look at the end of Yaakov's life, so Yaakov hands over the reins, right? Who does he hand over the reins to? Well, it turns out he hands over the reins to two different sons. On the one hand, he hands over the reins to Yehuda. On the other hand, he hands over the reins to Yosef. And there's a lot to speak about that. And that's an interesting thing. It's an interesting model where Yaakov very, very consciously hands over the reins. And here, for the first time, we actually have leadership, right? When Avram passes on to Yitzchak, it's not leadership. It's that Yitzchak is the only son. That's right. And when Yitzchak passes on to Yaakov, in his eyes, he's the only son. Yaakov says, no, there's no, right? There's the whole picture over here, the unity of the people, which is, again,
parallel to David.
And within that unity, there needs to be leadership. That theme of passing on leadership is one that really it hangs over a lot of the stories at the end of Chumash and through Nevi'im Rishonim. Moshe, at the end of his life, Hashem says it's time for you to die, and Moshe says, no, I'm not ready yet, because we need somebody who's going to take over for me. Mm-hmm. Right, which is an incredible moment. He says, no, I'm not going to let you kill me to take me yet. There needs to be somebody else. I'm not going to let you leave these people without a leader. And you can see within Tanakh the places where there is a passing on of leadership and what that means, and where there isn't a passing on of leadership. So from Moshe to Yoshua, we have that movement, and that's a very smooth movement. And we have Moshe brings the people up, and Yoshua takes them the next step. But Yoshua doesn't leave a leader behind him. And that opens up the chaos of Sefer Shoftim and of the beginning of Sefer Shmuel. It really is hundreds of years of chaos because there is no leadership and there's no continuity in leadership. David goes out of his way to make sure there is going to be continuity, and he does so in a way that that really reminds us of Yaakov and reminds us of Moshe. He does so during his own lifetime. He doesn't wait for himself to die. Most kings die, and then there's a battle amongst the kids. David wants to make sure that he understands that there almost was a battle amongst the kids. It's going to end. And when you take a look at the entire Davidic dynasty, what's incredible is that there really isn't, when you go from one generation to the next, there is no battle over who's going to take over for 15 generations, which is extraordinary, right? And that, I think, again, one of, there are a lot of messages, we can take from anything, but I think one of the things that Torah is trying to let us know is that handing that over, ensuring the future is part of what makes great leadership. It's an interesting thing. There was a guy named Jim Collins. I think he's still alive. And he did research on leadership. He wrote a book called Good to Great. He was a serious researcher, and he discovered that there are 5 qualities that identify the difference between great leaders and good leaders and adequate leaders. One of those 5 qualities we spoke about earlier, and that is the ability to acknowledge error. Accepting responsibility for mistakes. The second is ensuring that you create a leadership pipeline. It's not about you. It's about the people. Yeah. You got to put the people at the center. If it's about you, if it's a personality cult, then you will fail ultimately as a leader, because when you're gone, everything falls apart. What great leaders do is they make sure that there's continuity.
It brings up 2 thoughts for me. One is more biblical and one is just more human. On the biblical side, what you've described now is there's a complexity to it, because we know that there's sort of 2 warring perspectives. One perspective says the people shouldn't need a leader. As long as they would follow the Torah and then follow the mitzvot, then really, everybody should be able to lead their lives appropriately. It's a very utopian idea. The people themselves reject it. They reject it in the beginning of Sefer Shmuel and Perek Chet, and throughout the period of the Shoftim, we have all these questions about, was that supposed to be the case? Were there supposed to be these local leaders? And God seems to have appointed local leaders, but this question of, was there supposed to be one dominant central leader, or was that a model that kind of wasn't desired? You don't suggest that it's not desired. It's interesting that, as you said before, Hashem doesn't actually appoint another leader, and it has to be Moshe who asks for it. There seems to be this desire that if we're going to have a central leader, it's going to have to be that we ask for it, but not that God necessarily chooses it. So on one hand, there's like a very strong biblical thread that doesn't really like central leadership for all of the reasons that we see happening because of what happens in Shlomo's time and in general all the faults of the monarchy. On the other hand, it seems that in reality the people like it. At that point of history, it's the best worst option in terms of centralized leadership. Obviously, in the modern world, we've discovered other models, but it's a real tension, that piece between them. Meaning, if we have to have a leader, then we want to have a great king who's going to be able to recognize their faults, etc. But in terms of the biblical text, it seems to be that there's a real, I would say the divine perspective almost says, I don't really want there to be one leader, but I recognize it in the world we function in today, right? So meaning, so you're going to have to do it, so let's make it good and let's make it with all these stipulations. That's like the biblical thought that comes up for me in what you're describing. But the other piece on the human level is this piece about worrying there's taking care of and worrying that after you pass away, there won't be chaos. And this isn't just the stuff of leaders. It's the stuff of regular people in their family lives, right? It's making sure that Yerusha is something, right, of inheritance, and that if there's family businesses or all these messy things that often have to do with money, but not only, that unearth all of the, who was liked more, blah, 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 if instructions aren't left really, really clear. They're really important for leaders in terms of the institutions they lead. Just by the way, as an example, I mean, of course, there's going to be more complex than that. But one of the things that was said after the assassination of Charlie Kirk is that, it wasn't a personality cult. Like he had a very big institution that he had created behind him that will be able to continue that work. I don't want to get into the details or the politics of it, but it was just Dafka was something that they said about him and about his work, that the fact that he was horrifically killed doesn't mean that what he was trying to do is an effort that has to die. And that takes tremendous greatness by a leader. But I don't want to underemphasize how much that's also just leadership within the family, like how people respond within their own family, worrying about their family's life after they're not there anymore is of paramount importance.
Yeah. I mean, and truth is that you can take it down not only to a family level, but just as an individual, right? Everybody wants a piece of themselves to continue.
Yeah. And, we try and do our best in our lifetime to make sure that something positive of that legacy will remain.
Right.
Thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure.
Real pleasure to have you. Shabbat Shalom. And Chazak, Chazak, V'nit Chazek. We have finished the book of Breshit, and we'll be continuing all of our coming weeks by looking at the Haftorah as well. Looking forward to the book of Shemot. Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.